Okay, they've gone now. Yeah, so where was I? Freedom and determinism, compatibilism. Okay, so compatibilists, well, let's go back. Okay, so as you said, determinism is the view that given the laws of nature and all the prior facts, the future facts are all fixed, they're all determined. Freedom, the way we're going to talk about it, is the kind of freedom that gives us moral accountability. Right? It's a full-on freedom. I mean, it makes us morally accountable for our actions. Incompatibilism is the view that freedom and determinism are not compatible. Both libertarians and hard determinists are incompatibilists, but the hard determinist believes that determinism is true, and the libertarian thinks that determinism is false and that we therefore have free will. And then finally, this view, compatibilism, or soft determinism, according to which freedom and determinism are, in fact, compatible. So how do they go about this? Well, the compatibilist says that all that's required for freedom is an intention to do something, right? So one does what one intends to do, and that one is not forced or compelled to perform the action in question contrary to one's will. So given those two conditions, that one intends to do what one does and one is not compelled to perform that action, then you are free in the sense that you are morally accountable for that action. This might seem slightly counterintuitive because determinism really does imply that only one option is available to us. If you did push your friend off the cliff, that was your only option in many ways. It was always going to happen. There was only one possible outcome to that situation. But I mean, this isn't. There only being one possible outcome doesn't necessarily prove that you shouldn't be held morally accountable. Harry Frankfurt, for example, provides an example. I'll give a similar one now. So suppose you want John to shoot Jane. Okay, you want John to shoot Jane, and you've got a mind control device, and you can choose to make John shoot Jane, whatever happens. Now, you would rather John shoot Jane off his own volition, and you think that he probably will. So you send him into a room with a gun, and there he is with Jane. Now, you've decided that if John chooses not to shoot Jane, right, that you'll make him do it anyway, right, because you have a mind control device. You can make him do it. But John had the intention to kill Jane when he went into the room. And John does in fact kill Jane. So you don't have to use your mind control device. You don't have to use it. Because John shot Jane anyway. But if John didn't shoot Jane off his own volition, then you would have made him do it anyway. So there's only really one possible outcome. John was always going to shoot Jane, but as a matter of fact, John intended to shoot Jane, and he wasn't compelled to or forced to by you in any way. So although there was only one sort of possible outcome, John should be held morally accountable for shooting Jane anyway. Okay, so compatibilism says that the only conditions for moral accountability is that one does what one intends to do, and that one is not compelled to do it, or forced. Essentially forced. They're not forced to perform that action. Okay, just have a sip of water. So, what are you going to do if you write an essay on free will and determinism? Well, Make sure that you outline all the core concepts, as is the case with any essay. So you're going to outline what determinism is and what freedom is and what hard determinism is and soft determinism, compatibilism. If all these things are relevant, pick and choose the ones that are relevant. And then make sure that you write a proper introduction and a proper conclusion, and make sure that you state your conclusion in your opening paragraph. So you say that you're going to argue that freedom and determinism are compatible, or you're going to argue for this or that, or whatever the question asks. Just make sure that you answer the question in that opening paragraph, and make sure that your argument points towards that conclusion at the end. Make sure you can justify your conclusion by the time you get to the end of your essay. Okay, so final thing I'm going to talk about is philosophy of time stuff. So remember the two theories, the two ontologies of time that we talked about were presentism and determinism. There are others, and in a philosophy of time course we go into those. But in this introduction, I'm just going to focus on presentism and determinism. So the presentist thinks that there's something special about the present. The present is this dynamic moment that moves forward from the past into the future at a rate of 1 second per second. It moves forwards into the future, and as it does so, it brings entities into and out of existence. So the only entities that exist are the things that exist in the present. No entities in the future exist. No entities in the past exist. All and only entities that exist are those things that exist in the present. Now that contrasts with eternalism, where eternalist says that no, all entities that are in the past, in the present, that is in 2016, and in the future, they're all ontologically on a par. They're equally real, right? So you look at yourselves and you consider yourself a very real entity, but the dinosaurs 63 million years ago are equally real as we are now. It's not that they just were equally real, right? The presentists will say that. The presentists will say, well, dinosaurs were real back 63 million years BC. No. The eternalist says, no, dinosaurs are equally real now as you are. Okay? Things exist essentially tenselessly, right? There's no such thing as a special present moment that moves from the past into the future. Everything just exists ontologically on a par, right? So that's a kind of presentism, eternalism distinction. Only things in the present exist for the presentist, and the present moves forward, and for the eternalist, all things, past, present, and future, exist ontologically on a par. Time travel. Lots of different ways, I suppose, of talking about time travel. But I think let's focus on David Lewis's account, according to which time travel is essentially where there's a discrepancy between your personal time and your external time. So your personal time is the time according to your watch. Yes, I don't have a watch. But anyway, if I was wearing a watch, it would be the time according to my watch. And external time is the time according to the clocks on the wall. According to the clocks. So it's clocks and watches. So when does this discrepancy happen? Well, suppose I travel back in time 10 minutes. Okay. And I jump in my time machine now, and it's 11 o'clock. So suppose it takes me 1 minute to travel back 10 minutes. So I look at my watch, and after the time travel, my watch says 11:01 because it's taken a minute for me to travel backwards in time. However, the clock on the wall there that says 10:50, 10 to 11, because it's travelled backwards in time by 10 minutes. So there's a discrepancy between the time on my watch and the time on the clock. Okay, so that's when time travel happens, when there's a discrepancy between your personal time and your external time. Let's talk about presentism and time travel. Okay, so remember that presentism is the view that only things in the present exist, only entities in the present exist. Well, if only entities in the present exist, it looks like that poses a problem for time travel, because we tend to only be able to travel to places that exist. I mean, I can travel to Melville because Melville's just up the road. It will take me 23 minutes to walk there. And when I get there, my house will be there, and I can cook my dinner. Okay. I can't, however, travel to the Land of Oz, right? Because the Land of Oz doesn't exist. Okay, I can't travel to places that don't exist. It's fairly obvious, really. Doesn't the same thing apply for time travel, for the presentist at least? I mean, for the presentist, the past doesn't exist, right? 63 million years BC, no entities, nowhere exists 63 million years BC, because the only things that exist are in the present. In other words, there's nowhere to go. If there's nowhere to go, how could you go there? Okay? So how could you travel backwards in time if there's nowhere to go? Well, you can't. At least that's the nowhere argument. Now, if time travel were possible, then you could travel backwards in time and travel to somewhere that doesn't exist, right? But you can't travel backwards in time, so time travel is impossible. Okay. So there's your nowhere argument, in essence. For more detail, again, go back to your lecture slides. That has the argument detailed out in a more structured way. But that's the essence of it. Okay. So you need to know why time travel might be difficult for the presentist. Now, I mean, there are a number of responses. I mean, some people think that, well, it doesn't matter that the present, that those entities don't exist when you leave. Those past entities don't exist when you leave. What's important is that, those past entities, if you like, exist when you arrive. So, although when you get in your time machine in 2016, 63 million BC, and all the dinosaurs there don't exist, so long as by the time you've travelled there in your time machine, those things exist, that's fine. Okay, so that's one possible response. Right. Okay, there are other responses and there are other arguments, but go through your lecture slides, have a look. Finally, today I'll talk to you about the grandfather paradox. I remember paradoxes arise when you end up with one proposition that ends up being both true and false. So you have if you have something, you ask, okay, well, can we travel backwards in time? Now, as a paradox, if the answer is yes, then the same proposition is both true and false. Now, the grandfather paradox states that if time travel is possible, then the proposition, I can kill my grandfather before my father was born, propositions like that, is both true and false. So let's think about why it would be true. I mean, suppose I can travel backwards in time and I have a gun and I'm a really good shot and I can travel to precisely the location that my grandfather is at, and so on and so forth. It seems that if I arrive where my grandfather is, and with a gun and with ammunition, and I have the skills, and so on and so forth, then it seems like I can kill my grandfather. If I can travel backwards in time, then I can kill my grandfather. Okay. The problem, of course, is that if my grandfather is killed in 1930, before my father is born, then my father wouldn't have been born, then I wouldn't have been born, and so I wouldn't have been able to travel back in time and kill my grandfather. So it's logically impossible for me to travel backwards in time and kill my grandfather. So I can't kill my grandfather. The proposition, I can kill my grandfather before my father was born, is false. But now we have it such that it's both true and false. That proposition is both true and false, and so it's a contradiction, and so we've generated our paradox. So, the argument goes, time travel must be impossible. David Lewis argues that this is not so. He argues that this paradox is only an apparent paradox, and it only arises through confusion, through an equivocation on the word can. Can, the word can, he suggests, is being used in two different ways, essentially. On the one hand, it's being used with respect to only does one have the ability and the means to do it, and the other is a more broader category, including the logical possibility of doing it. Okay, so in essence, it's not the same proposition being true and false at the same time. They're two distinct propositions. They have different meanings. The first one is asking, can you do it with respect to, do you have the ability and the ammunition and so on? And the other proposition is asking, as well as those things, is it just simply logically possible? And the answer for that, of course, is no, it's not logically possible. But those two sentences, those two propositions have different meanings. And given that they have different meanings, they're not the same proposition. And if they're not the same proposition, then one being true and one being false is not a contradiction, right? It does not generate a paradox anymore. So if no paradox is generated, then the grandfather paradox does not prove that time travel is possible, is impossible rather. Now, of course, that doesn't make it the case that time travel must be possible, right? All it does is show that the grandfather paradox, at least on the face of it, does not prove that time travel is impossible in the way that it was supposed to in the first place. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'll just reiterate the rules for the exam tomorrow. So read the paper very carefully. I know that sounds obvious, but read the paper very carefully and make sure that you answer the questions that you're being asked. Don't just scribble down everything that you've learnt. You see the word Ubuntu and then write down everything you know about Ubuntu. Don't do that. Read the question and answer the question, please. Okay, this is a serious problem that happened last time and lots of people just didn't really answer the question. So I'd rather we didn't have that situation again. Secondly, remember that you have to answer all 5 of the questions in part 1, but you only choose to answer one question from part 2. So in part 1, you're going to devote roughly, say, 10 minutes to answering each question. In part 2, it's one essay question, and you're going to spend roughly an hour answering that question. And it's 25 marks for part 1 and 25 marks for part 2. Read the question carefully, read the paper carefully, make sure that in the second part you write a proper essay with an introduction and a conclusion and an argument. And in part 1, you just answer the question. You don't need to write down introductions and conclusions. If it just asks you what knowledge is, what the tripartite account is, what Ubuntu is, just answer the question. Okay? There's no need for a particular argument here. And yeah, I think that's about it. So good luck for tomorrow. I hope you do well and show up at 8:30 sharp. In fact, show up at 8:15 if possible, so that you can all get into the lecture theatre. We're going to be starting at 8:30, preferably on the dot. And if you're late, then university regulations require me to prevent you from entering the lecture, the examination hall. So it's really in your interest to show up on time. I shall see you all in the morning.